Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. The house that wouldn't let go. I used to be a police officer in a quiet city in Virginia, where every street seemed ordinary and every home looked safe. But there was one neighborhood in particular that always stood out, not because of crime or poverty, but because of its haunting silence and the stories whispered among us officers. It was an upscale neighborhood with sprawling lawns and elegant homes, the kind of place people dream about living in. Yet behind the beautiful facades, there was one house that seemed to pulse, with an energy that felt deeply wrong. Where I was a rookie, older officers told me about a doctor who once lived there. They said he attempted a self-surgery, numbing his own stomach and making an incision to perform some twisted operation. But something went horribly wrong. Unable to feel the blade, he cut too deep, severing himself from life. When paramedics arrived, they found him clutching his intestines. Barely alive, his final moments a grotesque testament to madness. That image alone was enough to make my skin crawl, even though I never saw it firsthand. Years later, I got a call to respond to a house in that very neighborhood. A young woman had been found dead by her older sister. As I pulled up, the house looked picture perfect, yet a wave of unease washed over me. The front porch was littered with empty energy drink cans, and a Ouija board sat atop a patio table like some twisted invitation. Something about the air felt heavy, like a thick fog of despair clinging to the property. Inside, the family was inconsolable. Emily, the girl who had died, was only 19. Her mother and father were sobbing in the living room, while her older sister tried to speak through her tears. Another officer stayed with them as I made my way to the basement. Where they said she was, the basement was dim, unfinished, and cold. Two lonely light bulbs hung from the ceiling, their faint glow casting eerie shadows across the clutter. More energy drink cans were scattered around, and yet another Ouija board rested on a small coffee table. That's when I saw her, Emily. She was hanging from a rafter, her body swaying gently, suspended by an exercise band tied tightly around her neck. I froze for a moment, the silence in the room deafening except for the faint creak of the rafter under her weight. Another officer joined me, and together we worked to bring her body down. Later, Emily's sister confided in me. The two had been very close, and she shared how Emily had become obsessed with the Ouija board in recent months. Emily believed she was communicating with a dead boyfriend. She would stay up all night, chugging energy drinks to stay awake, talking to him through the board. Her sister said Emily claimed he begged her to join him in the afterlife. She believed it so fully that she surrendered herself to the idea, stepping off into whatever world she thought awaited her. As I listened, I couldn't shake the unsettling aura of the house. It wasn't just the tragedy. I'd seen death before, more times than I wanted to admit. But here, something felt different. It felt like the house was alive, watching, feeding on sorrow. 2 weeks later, I was called to the scene of a horrific car accident. A convertible BMW had flipped and rolled, landing upside down. The driver, a woman, was still strapped in her seat, her neck twisted unnaturally as though some invisible hand had turned her head almost completely around. 25 feet away lay a man's body, ejected from the car, mangled beyond recognition. As we worked to secure the scene, I pulled out the man's ID to radio it in. That's when I froze. My partner and I recognized the names instantly. These weren't strangers. They were Emily's parents. 2 weeks to the day after losing their daughter, they had met a gruesome end on a lonely road. Breaking the news to Emily S.'s older sister was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She was now utterly alone. Her grief felt bottomless, like a black hole pulling everything nearby into its darkness. For a while, I kept in touch with her. She inherited her parents' estate and their life insurance payout. Hoping to escape the pain, she sold the house, bought a new place and tried to rebuild her life. But healing never came. A month later, I heard from another officer that she had been struck by a car while jogging. She clung to life in a coma for several weeks before quietly slipping away. The house, I later learned, was the very same one where the doctor had died all those years ago. Some of my fellow officers brushed it off as coincidence, but deep down I couldn't. Too many lives lost in the orbit of that home. Too much pain. Too much darkness. I began to wonder if Emily had opened a door that should have stayed shut, inviting something into the house, or if that something had always been there, waiting patiently for its next victim. Years have passed since then. I left the police force and moved several states away, hoping to leave the nightmares behind. But the house still haunts me in small ways. Twice now, I've found Ouija board planquettes lying on the sidewalk near my mailbox. I don't touch them. I use a stick to push them into the storm drain, my heart pounding as I do. Are they just random objects? Or are they reminders that the darkness I walked away from isn't done with me yet? Sometimes, late at night, I dream of that house. In my dream, it's not just a building. It breathes. It watches. It whispers my name. And when I wake up, drenched in sweat, I can almost feel its cold, damp air clinging to my skin. I tell myself it's all in my head, that the evil stayed behind. But deep down, I'm not so sure. Even now, when I walk past certain shadows, I can't shake the sense that something is following me, watching, waiting. The trail that shouldn't exist. When I was a boy growing up in rural Virginia, my life revolved around my dirt bike. It was more than a hobby, it was an obsession. My afternoons were consumed with riding, exploring the woods behind my parents' house. There was a single trail that stretched the entire length of our neighborhood, winding through dense trees and over small hills. I knew that trail like the back of my hand. Every rut, every exposed tree root, every sharp turn had been etched into my memory. Riding it became second nature, the kind of muscle memory where you don't even have to think anymore. It was my escape from everything, a place where the world felt simple and safe. But when I was 13, the dreams began. In these dreams, the familiar trail would suddenly change. A new path would appear, one I'd never seen before. This hidden trail would lead me to a clearing deep in the woods, perfectly circular and eerily quiet. I'd ride into the clearing, a strange sense of purpose pulling at me, as though I was supposed to find something there. Yet, just as I began searching, I'd wake up. These dreams came often, so vivid they felt real, and they stayed with me long after I opened my eyes. One sunny afternoon, about a year later, I was riding the old trail as usual, cruising along in a relaxed daze. But as I crested a familiar hill, my heart nearly stopped. There it was, the intersection from my dreams. A narrow path cut sharply off the main trail, the earth freshly disturbed, as though it had just appeared. My dirt bike idled as I stared, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I really never noticed this before? Was it always here? I sat for what felt like hours, debating with myself, before finally deciding to turn back. If it was still there tomorrow, I told myself I would ride it. The next day, I couldn't stay away. I rode directly to the spot, fully expecting the mysterious path to have vanished, but it hadn't. It was there, cutting into the woods like a scar. Against my better judgment, I turned down the path, gripping the handlebars tighter than usual. The air felt different here, cooler somehow, heavy with a damp, earthy smell. My tires crunched over fallen leaves as I slowly made my way forward. Within a minute, I arrived at the clearing. It was exactly as it had been in my dreams, a perfect circle surrounded by dense forest. No sound, no wind, just an oppressive stillness pressing in on all sides. I shut off my bike and climbed off, leaving the motor ticking softly as it cooled. I pulled off my helmet and looked around, my breathing loud in my ears. What the hell is this? I whispered to no one. I walked the perimeter, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. Then it hit me, a sensation like ice water pouring down my back. I felt eyes on me, the kind of eyes that weren't just watching, they were waiting. Dread pulled in my stomach, heavy and cold. I didn't know why, but I felt with absolute certainty that I wasn't supposed to be here. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I shoved my helmet back on, kicked my bike to life and tore down the trail, desperate to escape. But as I rode, panic took hold. The trail seemed endless. It should have taken less than a minute to return to the main path, yet I rode for what felt like hours without reaching it. The trees blurred past in a dizzying swirl of greens and browns. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I skidded to a stop, my chest heaving, and spun the bike round to retrace my path. Within seconds, I found myself back at the clearing. That's when I realized I was trapped. No matter which direction I took, the clearing pulled me back like a magnet. My mind raced for solutions, and I remembered the rope in my dad's garage. The next day, I returned with a spool of bright yellow rope. I tied one end to a tree at the intersection and the other round my waist. I told myself the rope would guide me back if the path tried to play tricks again. Back at the clearing, I scanned the trees for answers, forcing myself to stay calm despite the rising terror in my chest. That's when I saw it, a figure, half hidden behind a blackened tree. Its face was charred, twisted, and wrong, like a grotesque mask. When its eyes met mine, my bike's engine sputtered and died. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned back toward the tree, but the figure had vanished. The woods were still and empty, yet the sense of being hunted remained. I ran for my bike, heart pounding, but as I fled, the rope tangled in my chain. It snapped tight, yanking me from the seat. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ribs. When I looked up, the figure was standing at the trail's edge, holding the rope in its blackened hand. Its twisted smile spread wider as it gathered the rope inch by inch. My body refused to move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as it stepped closer. The air grew cold and heavy, thick with the stench of burning wood and decay. Its voice was a low hiss vibrating through my skull, though no words formed. Then, everything went black. I woke hours later on the main trail, my bike gone, the intersection gone, the rope gone. My parents never found the bike. I never found the courage to ride again. Something stayed with me, though, a hollow emptiness in my chest, a sense that a part of me had been left behind in that clearing. Years later, I still dream of that trail, and every time, the figure is waiting, closer than before. Its hollow eyes locked on mine, the shadow in the doorframe. I grew up in a century-old house that stood proudly as a relic of another time. By the mid-1980s, it was already 105 years old, a grand yet unsettling presence, with creaking floors and drafty hallways. From the outside, it looked beautiful. Tall windows framed with ornate woodwork, an elegant porch, and a history that drew admiration from visitors. But for me, a child at the time, the house carried an invisible weight. It always felt heavy inside, as though the walls held on to memories that weren't entirely kind. There was a lingering sense of unease, as if the air itself carried secrets too ancient to speak aloud. Between the ages of 3 and 8, I began seeing something strange, something that should have terrified me, yet somehow didn't. In the mornings, as soft light poured through my curtains, a misty shape would appear in the doorframe of my room. It was featureless, a vague silhouette of a head and shoulders, almost like static on an old TV screen. Sometimes it flickered faintly, barely noticeable. Other times it grew more solid, its edges sharp and defined before fading again. At first, I thought I was imagining it, still half asleep, but I'd pinch myself, recite the alphabet, even say prime numbers aloud to prove I was awake. And every time, the shape remained. Oddly enough, it never felt malicious. Instead, it became a peculiar companion, a silent observer as I lay in bed reading comic books or cereal boxes. It played a sort of morning peekaboo, ducking in and out of view as though shy. I never saw it at night, only in the hours between dawn and late morning. By the time the sun climbed higher, it would disappear completely, as if the daylight was too strong for it to linger. Over time, I stopped fearing it and started to accept its presence. It felt like watching a natural phenomenon, mysterious but oddly comforting. The oddest part was how it seemed confined to the doorway. It never entered my room fully. never moved past the top corner of the 10-foot door frame. Sometimes, more of its shape would emerge, a blowy mass that stretched and wavered like smoke, but it always stayed just within the threshold, as though something held it back. Was it truly aware of me, or was I simply witnessing some strange echo, like watching ripples in a pond long after the stone had been thrown, even as a child? I couldn't decide. As I grew older, I stopped seeing it. Perhaps it was because I began closing my door at night, craving privacy in my preteen years, or maybe it simply faded away on its own. Still, the memory lingered, growing more surreal with time. My family loved digging into local history, and we learned that the house had been built by a distant relative who owned a sawmill and a hotel. He was rumored to have been a ruthless man, involved in shady dealings and possibly even murder. The house had survived a fire in the late 1800s, and parts of it, the stairwell near my room, for instance, were reconstructed decades later. No one ever died tragically there, at least not according to records. But Appalachia is old, its mountains heavy with stories older than settlers. Who knows what had once walked this land? Sometimes I wondered if that shape in my doorframe wasn't tied to my family at all, but was something much older, something that had been there long before any of us. The house itself carried moods. Certain rooms felt thick with sadness, the air so heavy it pressed against your skin. In the attic, where I sometimes played, I'd get an odd sensation, as if unseen eyes were watching me. The hair on my arms would rise, and my ears would ring faintly, like the pressure change you feel on a plane. The silence there wasn't ordinary, it felt alive to complete. I learned not to panic. Even as a small child, I sensed that fear wasn't the right response. So, I calmly put away my toys and leave the attic without rushing. Looking back, I think I knew instinctively that whatever watched me didn't feed on bravery. It fed on fear. Strangely, I've always had a steady demeanor, even as an adult. People comment on my ability to remain calm in emergencies, to mask my emotions when needed. Maybe it started in that house, in those moments when I taught myself to walk away without reacting. Perhaps that's why I never screamed when the misty figure appeared. Perhaps it was waiting for fear that never came. The house burned down years later during renovations. Electrical issues, they said. When I drive past the empty lot where it once stood, I can almost see the old doorframe in my mind, with that faint, flickering shape peeking around the corner. I don't know if it's gone or if it found somewhere else to linger. Even now, in quiet mornings, I sometimes feel a subtle shift in the air, a prickling on my neck as though something is near. I never turn to look. Maybe that's why it hasn't followed me. Or maybe, just maybe, it never left. The house that wouldn't let me go. The house had been in my family for generations, tucked deep in the Pennsylvania mountains. It wasn't grand or sprawling, but there was a kind of quiet dignity about it. Built by my great-great-grandfather in the 1890s, it stood as a testament to those who came before me. The walls were lined with old photographs, some featuring ancestors whose names we knew, others showing faces we could no longer place, their features faded into eerie obscurity. As a child, I visited the house every summer, and though I felt an inexplicable connection to it, there was always a subtle edge to my affection. Some rooms carried a heavy stillness that made me hesitate before entering, as if I were intruding on a space that didn't entirely belong to me. One summer, when I was around 9 years old, something happened that I still can't explain. I'd been wearing a pair of sandals all weekend, and I remember placing them carefully by the cold, unused fireplace before going to bed on our last night there. The next morning, the sandals were gone. My parents and grandfather tore the house apart, searching every room, every closet, and every nook where a child might absent-mindedly leave her shoes. But they were nowhere to be found. Hours later, defeated, we drove the 2 hours back home with me barefoot in the back seat. The next day, my grandfather stayed behind to finish tidying up. When he woke in the morning, the sandals were back, sitting neatly by the fireplace where I'd left them. He told my mother about it later, joking that perhaps the house didn't want me to leave. It was the sort of story we laughed about, but there was an undertone of unease we didn't dare acknowledge. Years later, as an adult, I returned to the house with my daughter and a close friend. We spent a peaceful morning wandering the orchard behind the property, collecting apples and listening to the quiet. At one point, I left my vape pen on the kitchen table while stepping outside to load the car. When I came back, the pen was gone. Again, we searched high and low, turning the house upside down. There were only 3 of us there, and none of us had moved it. This time, the missing object never reappeared. I can't say if it was a coincidence, but it felt eerily similar to that childhood incident, and this time, the house seemed to be sending me a different kind of message. There's something deeply unsettling about feeling watched in a place that should feel safe. The house had always felt alive in its own way, breathing through the creaks of old floorboards and the whisper of the wind against the windows. But sometimes, I wondered if it was more than just the age of the building. Was it possible for a house to hold onto its occupants, to imprint itself on their lives in ways they couldn't shake? Strange as it was, the old house never frightened me completely. I felt tethered to it, as though some invisible thread connected us, and yet that thread seemed to pull both ways. My family has always said the house would one day be mine, passed down to me as the oldest grandchild per my great-great-grandfather's will. It feels like an inheritance and a burden at the same time. We never uncovered any dark secrets about the house, no murders, no tragic deaths beyond the ordinary rhythm of life and loss. But Appalachia is old, steeped in stories of spirits and energies that predate the foundations of any house. Maybe it didn't need a violent history to hold on to, something intangible. Maybe the land itself carried memories we couldn't see. Ivy often wondered if the house knew me in a way I didn't know myself. It seemed to have a peculiar fondness for my belongings. I was the only one in the family whose things went missing there. It felt deliberate, like the house was reaching for me, testing my presence, or perhaps reminding me that it was still there, still waiting for me to return. Now, every time I approach that old house, a strange mix of comfort and unease washes over me. I love it deeply, yet I can't shake the sense that there's something unfinished between us. Some silent exchange happening just beneath the surface of my understanding. I don't know if I'll ever find out what it wants from me, or what I want from it. One day, when the house is mine, I'll have to decide whether to embrace it fully or let it go. But part of me suspects that even if I try to leave, the house won't let go of me, the ghost that followed the wings. A few years ago, I was living just outside of Philadelphia in a quiet little suburban neighborhood where life moved at a predictable pace. It was late November, and one evening my wife and I had a craving for chicken wings. After scrolling through a few search results, I found a new wing joint that had recently opened in Royersford, Pennsylvania. It looked unassuming, but we decided to give it a shot. I placed an online order, hopped in my car, and made the short drive to pick up the food. The place was small, the kind of restaurant tucked into a strip mall you'd almost miss if you weren't looking for it. Inside, it smelled of hot oil and barbecue sauce. A middle-aged man greeted me from behind the counter. He was cheerful and warm, the kind of guy who exuded friendliness so effortlessly that you felt at ease within seconds. We chatted as he packed up my order, laughing about the Eagles' chances that season. His laugh was hearty, deep and infectious, and for a moment it felt like I was talking to an old friend. I thanked him, grabbed the food and headed home. The wings, as it turned out, weren't great. Too greasy, with a sauce that tasted more like sugar than spice. But that didn't matter. What stuck with me wasn't the food. It was the man behind the counter. He'd left an impression, even though it was such a brief encounter. Months later, that same man's name flashed across my phone screen as I scrolled through the local news. I froze, my stomach twisting into a knot. He'd been arrested for murdering his business partner over a money dispute. The details were gruesome and unsettling. He deburied her body in a secluded industrial area and parked her car elsewhere to throw off investigators. But the police had pieced it together: security footage, digital trails, evidence of a violent struggle in her home. The cheerful man I had joked with about football had been convicted of cold-blooded murder. I sat back in my chair, staring at the article, It felt surreal. How could someone so friendly, so ordinary, be capable of something so monstrous? My memory of that night at the wing shop replayed in my head on a loop. His easy laugh, his bright eyes, the casual way he handed me my food, asking if I wanted extra napkins. How could I reconcile that image with the man who had buried someone in the cold earth? The more I thought about it, the more it disturbed me. Not just because of what he had done, but because of how easily I had trusted him in that moment. It made me question how many others walk among us, hiding their darkness behind a mask of normalcy. How many times do we brush shoulders with people capable of terrible things and never even realize it? Over the next few weeks, I kept replaying the brief interaction in my mind. It didn't matter that he hadn't harmed me. Just knowing I had stood so close to someone who carried such darkness was enough to unsettle me. I even began to wonder about his laugh, whether it had been genuine or just another layer of his disguise. Eventually, the wing shop closed down. A for lease sign appeared in the window and the building sat empty, its glass doors smudged with fingerprints and dust. Every time I drove past it, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The cheerful man was gone, locked away forever, but his presence lingered somehow. Even now, years later, I still think about him sometimes, not because of the wings, but because of the way evil can hide in plain sight, wrapped in a smile and a friendly voice. It's a quiet reminder that we never truly know who we're talking to, and sometimes that's the most terrifying thing of all. The Whispering Road. My grandmother's house sat at the very end of a long, unpaved road, tucked deep into the woods like a secret the world had long forgotten. The road itself was a character in its own right, comically bumpy, overgrown with tangled bushes and creeping vines, and littered with puddles that seemed to multiply after even the lightest rain. Over the years, stories of hauntings had woven their way through our family. Tales passed between relatives during late-night conversations when the firelight danced, and shadows grew long. I always brushed them off as exaggerations, products of overactive imaginations and too many scary movies. That is, until one night made me believe every word. At the time, I was living with my grandmother, my boyfriend often making the trek to visit me. Since his parents refused to risk their car's suspension on the treacherous road, he would walk the 20-minute stretch from the main road to her house, and I would sometimes meet him halfway. It had become our routine, and I never thought twice about it until that night. It was late, the sky an unusual shade of blue for the hour, casting an ethereal glow over the trees. On our walk back toward the entrance after his visit, I told him the family's collection of ghost stories about the silver coins buried at the property's corners to appease a restless deer spirit, about the strange knocking sounds on countertops late at night. He listened intently but seemed uneasy, his footsteps slowing as I spoke. Finally, he warned me about one thing in particular. Don't whistle at night. That warning should have stayed with me. But as we parted ways and I made my return alone, I found myself humming a tune. The stillness of the woods was comforting at first. The leaves rustled softly, and the road stretched ahead in familiar curves. But then, as I rounded a bend flanked by dense foliage, I heard it. A voice. A man's voice, frail yet urgent, calling out a single word. Help. At first, I froze, my heart pounding as my mind raced to make sense of it. Maybe there was an old man in trouble, I reasoned. But no, there was no one living on this road but my grandmother. It didn't make sense. Against my better judgment, I strained to listen, but silence followed. Shaking it off as imagination, I quickened my pace, eager to get home. As I reached a familiar field, where a fallen tree had lain for years, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond, the tree, about 30 feet away, stood a tall, white figure. It wasn't a person, not really. It looked like an old-fashioned ghost costume, a simple pillar of white fabric draped over something impossibly still. It had no face, no features, but I could feel it watching me. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I sensed a strange tension in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, faster than my eyes could register, it darted behind the tree. The suddenness of its movement snapped me out of my trance. My instincts screamed at me to run. But somehow, I knew that drawing attention to myself would be a mistake. I forced my feet to move at a steady pace, my heart thundering in my ears. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. The walk home felt endless, each step stretching out like hours. When I finally emerged from the woods and saw my grandmother's porch light glowing in the distance, I nearly collapsed with relief. Inside, my grandmother sat calmly on her red couch, smoking a cigarette. She looked up as I entered and chuckled softly. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. I wanted to tell her everything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I managed a weak smile, nodded, and headed to bed. Even now, years later, I don't know what I saw that night. Was it a spirit? A warning? Or something far older and stranger than either? Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting by that fallen tree for someone else to walk by. The deer with backward knees. When I was a child growing up just north of Chicago, the fields and forests behind my best friend's house felt like endless worlds waiting to be explored. One particular afternoon, we spotted a small group of deer grazing at the edge of a clearing. The soft golden light of the setting sun seemed to cast everything in a dreamy haze. Being kids with no sense of boundaries, we decided to get closer. Convinced we might actually pet one if we moved slow enough. As we crept across the open field, I kept expecting the deer to bolt. But they didn't. They just kept grazing, their heads dipping down into the grass as if we weren't even there. It felt strange, almost too easy. My friend hung back a little, but I was determined. Step by cautious step, I closed the distance until I was no more than 6 feet away from one of them. That's when she finally lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I froze. There was something off about her gaze, something unsettling that made my stomach twist. It wasn't fear or curiosity, not the way a normal deer might look at a human, but something deeper, darker, as if she was peering into my thoughts. I forced myself to look away and noticed her knees. They were bloody. At first, I thought perhaps she had scraped them on a fallen branch or a rough patch of ground. But then I realized the truth. Her knees weren't just injured, they were facing the wrong way. Not like they were broken or twisted in an accident, but as though they had grown that way. Backward and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back a step. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The deer tilted her head slightly, and in that small movement, something in my mind screamed that this wasn't an animal. This wasn't right. Whatever stood before me wore the shape of a deer, but it wasn't one. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. Then my friend called my name from behind me, snapping the spell. I spun around to see him standing several yards away, waving frantically for me to come back. The sound of his voice broke whatever hold the deer had on me. Without looking back, I turned and bolted, my feet pounding the earth in a wild, desperate rhythm. We didn't stop running until we burst through his back door, gasping for air and collapsing onto the kitchen floor. I tried to explain to him what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. The more I thought about it, the more surreal it felt, like a nightmare I wasn't fully awake from. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe the deer really was injured, and my young mind turned a simple encounter into something monstrous. But every time I picture her knees bending, the wrong way, and those eyes, those impossibly deep, knowing eyes, I feel that same rush of cold terror. I haven't stepped foot in those woods since, and sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't looked away, if I had kept staring into her eyes. Would I still be here, or would I have followed her into whatever place she came from? The camp in the haunted valley, when I was in my final year at school. We went on what was meant to be a spiritual retreat, a kind of bonding experience before we all graduated, and scattered in different directions. The camp was tucked into a wide, open field bordered by a lazy river and a dense forest that climbed up the nearby mountains. It was beautiful in a quiet, timeless way, yet there was something about it that felt off. The buildings were old, their weathered wooden beams sagging slightly as though they carried the weight of untold stories. Even the air felt different there, heavy and still, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. We'd spent the day hiking through the surrounding forest, our shoes crunching on leaves and gravel as we laughed and tried to ignore how isolated it all felt. That evening, we gathered around a roaring campfire, eating, singing, and sharing jokes under the fading glow of the sun. When we were finally sent to bed, the girls went off to one dorm, and the few of us boys had the entire long hall to ourselves. It was a large room lined with rows of bunks, enough for 40 people. But that night there were only 6 of us. We spread out, each claiming a top bunk and settling in for what we hoped would be an easy night. Rest. The lights were out, but sleep didn't come immediately. We lay in the dark, whispering and chuckling, the muffled sounds of insects and night birds drifting in through the windows. Eventually, our voices faded and I felt my eyelids grow heavy. The room was calm and quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost warm. But sometime later, I'm not sure when, I awoke. Lifting my head slightly, I noticed my best friend on the bunk opposite mine staring too. He looked at me, his expression groggy but curious, and then he nodded slightly toward the bunk next to him. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. Then I saw it. There, standing at the foot of his friend's bed, was a figure. It wasn't one of us. I was certain of that. It was taller than anyone in our group, its silhouette faintly illuminated by the pale blue light filtering through the window. It stood perfectly still, its head slightly bowed as if staring at the sleeping boy. My friend and I locked eyes across the room, the same thought flashing wordlessly between us: we're not alone. A rush of cold washed over me, prickling my skin. I wanted to scream, to warn the others, but my voice caught in my throat. I could only watch as the figure crouched down slowly, its movements deliberate and strange. In the dim light, I realized with a sickening lurch that the boy it hovered over was still sleeping soundly. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to wake someone, to move, but I couldn't. It felt like my limbs had turned to stone. My friend must have felt the same, because he slowly pulled his blanket up over his head, his wide eyes disappearing beneath the fabric. I followed his lead, curling into a ball beneath my thin sheet, praying the figure wouldn't notice me. I don't know how long I lay there, holding my breath, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might wake everyone in the room. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. When morning came, sunlight streaming through the windows like a blessing, my friend and I shot out of bed at almost the same moment. Before I could even ask, he whispered, "You saw it too, right?" I nodded, my mouth dry. We both turned to the boy whose bed the figure had stood beside. He was awake, rubbing his eyes and stretching, completely unaware of what had happened in the night. To this day, I don't know what we saw: a ghost, a shadow, a trick of the light. All I know is that something was there, and we weren't supposed to see it. And even now, years later, when I think of that silent dorm in the haunted valley, I still feel the same chill creep up my spine. The woman on the hill nearly 20 years ago. I found myself backpacking through Chile with a group of friends, moving from town to town and living out of heavy rucksacks for weeks. We camped under open skies, slept in hostels, and hitchhiked along dusty roads, our laughter echoing in every place we stopped. But the trip took a dark turn when I fell seriously ill during our time in the Atacama Desert. What began as a mild fever grew into violent convulsions, and soon I was too weak to stand. My friends pressed on with their travels while I stayed behind at the home of one of our companion's parents. His stepfather, a self-proclaimed natural healer, treated me with strange herbal concoctions, dripping bitter liquids into my mouth as I drifted in and out of consciousness. At first, I trusted him, but as my condition worsened, a creeping fear began to bloom in my chest. I remember one night vividly. I was curled in their bathtub, shivering despite the heat, my body convulsing so violently I thought my bones would break. The taste of metal filled my mouth, and a buzzing sound roared in my ears. Then everything faded to black. When awareness returned, I felt grass beneath my bare feet. cold, damp, and soft. The smell of winter filled my lungs as I realized I was standing on a vast hill, beneath a pale grey sky. I didn't know how I got there, but I felt pulled, almost magnetically, toward the valley below. My friends were there, laughing, talking, completely unaware of my presence. Relief flooded me, and I began to run, my heart lifting with every step. I wanted nothing more than to reach them, to call out and feel their arms wrap around me. But as I ran, something strange happened. They didn't notice me, no matter how close I got. No heads turned, no eyes lifted. It was as if I were invisible, a ghost drifting through a world that could no longer see me. Confused and breathless, I slowed to a stop, watching them from only a few feet away. I couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that I wasn't supposed to be there. Then I felt her, a presence at my side, silent, yet undeniable. When I turned, a woman stood there, her face strangely familiar yet utterly alien. She looked so much like me it was unsettling, as if I were staring at an older version of myself. Her eyes met mine, calm and steady, and her voice was soft yet commanding as she spoke the simple words, "Go back." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't angry. It felt almost maternal, like the way a mother gently scolds a child for wandering too far. A strange mix of fear and comfort washed over me. Before I could respond, she vanished. Without thinking, I turned and began climbing the hill again, my fingers clawing at the earth, grabbing handfuls of ferns and mud. Each step felt heavier, the air thicker, as if I were pushing through water. I didn't know why I was going back, only that I had to. And then, everything went dark once more. When I woke again, I was in a hospital bed. The fluorescent lights above me flickered softly, and the steady beeping of a monitor filled the room. A doctor hovered nearby, shaking his head with a wry smile. "I don't know how you're still here," he said. "You were completely dehydrated. It's a miracle you survived." Later, when I reunited with my friends, I recounted what I had seen: the hill, the woman, the strange sense of urgency. As I described their conversation in the valley, their faces paled. Every detail I shared, down to the most mundane topics, matched exactly what they had been discussing that day. They swore they had never seen me, never heard my voice. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Was it a fever dream brought on by my illness? Or had I truly stood at the edge of something unknowable, teetering between life and death? Whatever it was, I'll never forget the woman's eyes, or the quiet authority in her voice when she told me to go back. The vault that wouldn't let me out. I worked for several years in a cemetery that had been built on the charred remains of an old carriage house. Long ago, that house burned to the ground, taking at least one man and several horses with it. The history of the land gave the place a weight, as though the air itself remembered screams and smoke. Even the cemetery office carried a certain unease. There were countless stories of strange occurrences whispered between staff, but I'd always brushed them off. Until the day I found myself locked inside the vault. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the air feels still and heavy. I was alone in the office, going about my usual duties when I felt it again. That sensation of being watched, it was a common feeling there, especially in the hallway leading to the records room. People said they'd seen a man's shadow flicker just out of sight, or heard the rhythmic tap of a cane echoing on the linoleum. I'd heard it on occasion, slow and deliberate, as though someone unseen was pacing back and forth. That morning I had a burial scheduled, but the family never showed. Hours later, I thought I heard voices in the lobby. Hopeful they had finally arrived, I went to check, only to find the room empty. A single chair rocked slightly in the corner, though no breeze stirred the air. I stepped outside, scanning the parking lot. My car sat alone in the sun. There were no other vehicles. The silence was so complete it felt alive, pressing in on me like a thick fog. Shrugging off my unease, I went back inside and down to the vault. The vault was massive, doubling as a records room where rows of aging file cabinets lined the walls. As I sifted through dusty folders, the heavy steel door behind me groaned loudly and slammed shut. My heart jumped into my throat. At first, I wasn't worried. The vault door had a mechanism that could be unlocked from the inside if you had the key. My stomach dropped when I realized my keys were still on the office desk. My phone too. The silence that followed was suffocating. I tried everything I could think of to force the door open, but it didn't budge. My hands grew raw from pulling and pounding. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, I heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps outside the vault. The shuffle of leather shoes. And then a low, guttural chuckle that sent a chill skittering up my spine. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. The laughter faded into a murmur, words I couldn't quite make out. Panic clawed at my chest, but something deep inside told me not to make a sound. I slid down to the cold concrete floor, my back against the door, forcing myself to take shallow breaths. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt strange in that dark room. Then, without warning, the door clicked and swung open violently. I tumbled backward, hitting the metal threshold hard enough to send sparks of pain shooting through my body. As I lay there stunned, a heavy scent filled the air, an acrid, leathery cologne I had never smelled before yet felt instinctively I should fear. When I finally scrambled to my feet, the hallway was empty. No footsteps, no laughter, only silence. I didn't waste another second. I locked up the office, my hands trembling as I jammed the key into place and sprinted to my car. To this day, I don't know who or what freed me from that vault, but every now and then, in the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear that same chuckle echoing in my ears, and I wonder if the man with the cane is still pacing those halls, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too far. The man who lurked in the cornfield. When I was 9 years old, my parents bought a house in the countryside of Indiana. The house itself wasn't much to look at, a plain 2-story structure with faded siding and creaky wooden floors. But what made it special was the land. Acres of golden cornfields stretched out in every direction, tall stalks swaying gently in the summer breeze. As a kid, I loved playing in those fields, weaving in and out of the rows, pretending I was an explorer discovering some lost world. The cornfield became my sanctuary, a place where the world felt quiet and safe. Or at least, it used to. One late afternoon in July, I was out in the fields alone. The sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows, turning the corn a deep orange hue. I remember stopping to listen to the rustling leaves when I heard something else. Something different. At first, it was faint, like the creak of an old door in the wind. But as I stood still, straining to hear, the sound became clearer, a steady, deliberate breathing. I froze. The sound didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was too deep, too rhythmic. My heart began to race as I slowly turned toward the direction of the sound. That's when I saw him, half hidden among the stalks, no more than 20 feet away. He was tall, impossibly thin, with a face that seemed wrong. His eyes were wide, almost bulging, and his mouth hung slightly open as if he was caught mid-sentence. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. For what felt like hours, we stared at each other in silence. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The air felt heavy, as if the corn itself was pressing in around me. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, the man raised his hand and beckoned me forward with a crooked finger. That broke the spell. My body jolted to life, and I bolted in the opposite direction, crashing through the stalks so fast they cut into my arms and face. I didn't stop until I reached the backyard, gasping for breath and slamming the sliding glass door shut behind me. When I told my parents, they brushed it off as an overactive imagination. Probably a neighbor checking on his crops, my dad said. But I knew better. There were no other houses for miles, and no one from the nearby farms had reason to be in our fields. That night, I barely slept, convinced I'd see his pale face pressed against my bedroom window. For weeks after, I refused to set foot in the cornfield. Even in broad daylight, I felt like he was still out there, waiting just beyond the first row of stalks. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, I swore I could hear that same steady breathing drifting through the open windows. One evening, just as summer was ending, my father came inside looking pale. "Did you leave a scarecrow out there?" he asked. I shook my head. We hadn't placed a scarecrow in the fields all season. He didn't say anything else, but that night he locked every door and window in the house. We moved away the following spring, leaving the cornfields behind. But even now, years later, I can still see his face when I close my eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes and that finger curling toward me. Sometimes I wonder if he was real, or if the field itself birthed him, feeding on the quiet isolation and turning it into something far darker. The thing in the mirror. When I was a teenager, my family moved into an old farmhouse in rural Maine. The place had a certain charm with its creaky floors, wide windows, and sprawling attic. But there was one feature of the house that made me uneasy from the very first night. A large, ornate mirror that hung in the upstairs hallway. Its frame was carved with intricate floral patterns, darkened from age, and its glass carried a faint haze that seemed to swallow light instead of reflecting it. My parents loved it, calling it antique, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave me. At first, I tried to ignore the unease, chalking it up to nerves from the move, but every time I passed the mirror, I found myself glancing into it, not out of vanity, but out of something closer to fear. It wasn't that I saw anything strange. No ghostly faces, no flickering shadows. It was the silence of the reflection that disturbed me. The hallway behind me always seemed a little too still, too quiet, like the mirror was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. One night, while everyone else slept, I crept down the hallway to use the bathroom. As I passed the mirror, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze. My reflection was there as expected, but something was wrong. It didn't move when I did. It stood still, staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Panic clawed up my chest, but I forced myself to step closer, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. In the dim moonlight, I studied the reflection, searching for some logical explanation. That's when its lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. I didn't move. I couldn't. My reflection raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hallway rug, and sprinted to my room, slamming the door behind me. I sat trembling in the corner until the first light of dawn broke through the curtains. When morning came, I cautiously crept back to the hallway. The mirror was there, silent and still. My reflection looked normal again, no smile, no outstretched hand. For days after, I avoided the hallway as much as possible, but my fear seemed to feed the mirror somehow. Every night, I began hearing faint whispers coming from it, so soft they were almost impossible to understand. Sometimes it sounded like my own voice, calling my name. Other times, it was laughter, low, hollow, and distant. One evening, I found the courage to tell my parents. They brushed it off, insisting it was just a bad dream. "It's only a mirror," my mother said gently, but when I glanced over her shoulder, I could have sworn I saw her reflection grinning at me in a way her real face wasn't. Eventually, I stopped looking into the mirror altogether. If I had to pass it, I kept my head down and my eyes averted, as though acknowledging it might give it more power. Weeks later, my father decided to move the mirror into storage, complaining that it made the hallway look too narrow. When they finally took it down, I expected to feel relief, but instead, an emptiness settled over me as if something was missing. That night, as I lay in bed, I woke to find my closet door slightly ajar. In the darkness, I caught a faint glimmer like moonlight on glass, and a familiar pair of eyes staring back. The face at the window. When I was a kid, my family lived in a small house on the edge of a quiet town in Oregon. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a yard that ended abruptly where the woods began. My bedroom faced those woods, and at night, the trees would sway and creak in the wind, their shadows dancing across my walls like long, crooked fingers. I never liked looking out my window after dark. Something about those woods felt alive, like they were holding their breath, waiting for me to slip up and look too long. One autumn night, I stayed up late reading under my blankets, the faint glow of a flashlight my only comfort. The house was still. My parents had long gone to bed, and even the wind outside had quieted. But then, out of the silence, I heard it, the faintest sound of scratching. It was soft at first, like a branch brushing against the siding. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more deliberate, until it was unmistakably coming from my window. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I pulled the blanket from my head and turned to face the window. At first, I saw nothing, just the reflection of my lamp in the glass and the faint outline of trees beyond. But then, two pale hands appeared, pressing against the outside of the glass. My breath caught in my throat. The hands were slender, almost skeletal, and they left faint, greasy smudges as they slid downward. And then the face appeared. It was a man, but not a man. His features were too sharp, his eyes too wide, gleaming in the faint moonlight. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and his head tilted ever so slightly, as though he were studying me. I couldn't move. My body felt rooted to the mattress, frozen under the weight of his gaze. His smile widened, and he lifted one finger to his lips in a slow, deliberate gesture, telling me to stay silent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but I managed to inch backward, pressing myself against the wall. Suddenly, my bedroom door creaked open, and my mom peeked in, asking why my light was still on. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the window with a trembling hand. She turned, but the glass was empty. No hands, no face, just darkness and the swaying trees. She reassured me it was probably a nightmare and stayed with me until I fell asleep. But before she left, I watched her glance at the window, her expression flickering for just a moment, something between confusion and concern. The next morning, I found faint streaks on the outside of the glass, like finger marks dragged down the pane. My dad brushed it off, saying it was probably condensation or dirt from a tree branch. But we didn't have any trees close enough to touch the window. For weeks after, I kept the curtains drawn tight every night, terrified of what I might see if I looked. And sometimes, in the stillness before sleep, I swore I could hear faint scratching, soft, patient, as though waiting for me to open the curtains again. Even now, as an adult, I can't bring myself to sleep with an uncovered window, because deep down, I know if I looked long enough, I might see that face smiling back at me once more. The hitchhiker in the rain. Years ago, I was driving home late one stormy night after visiting a friend in a nearby town. The rain poured down in thick sheets, and my windshield wipers struggled to keep up as I navigated the winding back roads that cut through miles of forest. It was the kind of night where the world feels unnaturally still. The only sound the rhythmic thump of wipers and the occasional roar of thunder. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and I gripped the wheel tightly, anxious to make it home. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights swept across a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a woman, soaked to the bone, her long dark hair plastered to her face. She was wearing a pale dress that clung to her thin frame, and she raised one arm, thumb out, asking for a ride. For a moment, I considered driving past. It was late, and picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere didn't seem smart. But something about her made me slow down. Maybe it was the way she looked so utterly fragile in the storm. Or maybe it was the guilt gnawing at me as I imagined leaving her to freeze in the rain. I rolled down the passenger window slightly, rain blowing in as I leaned over. "Do you need a ride?" I called out. She nodded silently, water dripping from her hair. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and watched as she slid into the seat beside me. She didn't say much, only murmuring the name of a road I didn't recognize. I glanced at her as I drove. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white, and she stared straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. Her bare feet left wet prints on the floor mat. Trying to break the silence, I asked where she was headed and if she was okay. She turned to me then, her dark eyes catching the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "I just need to get home," she whispered. Her voice was so soft I almost didn't hear her over the rain. We drove in silence for several minutes, the air inside the car thick and heavy. Eventually, she pointed to a narrow dirt road ahead. "Turn here," she said quietly. The road was barely visible in the downpour, but I obeyed. It wound deep into the woods, the trees pressing in so close it felt like they might scrape the sides of the car. Finally, she spoke again. "You can drop me off here." She pointed to a crumbling stone gate, barely standing in the overgrown weeds. Beyond it, I could just make out the faint outline of a house, or what had once been one. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, and vines choked the walls. It looked abandoned, long forgotten by anyone but the forest. I hesitated. "Are you sure this is it?" I asked, my voice uncertain. She turned to me then, her pale lips curling into the faintest smile. "Yes, thank you." As she stepped out into the rain, I caught one last glimpse of her face in the glow of my headlights. There was something strange about her expression, something almost relieved. She closed the door softly, and I watched as she walked up the path, her figure dissolving into the darkness and rain. When I drove by that road the next morning out of curiosity, there was no gate, no path, no house, just trees and wild undergrowth stretching endlessly in every direction. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't dropped her off at her home. I'd dropped her off where she belonged. The knocking on the glass, it was late one evening in December when I first heard it. I was home alone, curled up on the couch in the living room with a book and a steaming mug of tea. The house was quiet except for the occasional groan of the old heating system and the wind, rattling the shutters outside. It was the kind of night that made you grateful to be indoors. The cold kept at bay by the warm glow of the lamps, but then came the sound, soft at first, so faint I almost didn't register it. A tap, then another, delicate and rhythmic, like the tip of a fingernail against glass. I sat down, my book, and strained to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time, from the direction of the large sliding glass door that led out to the backyard. My first thought was that it must be a tree branch swaying in the wind, but when I remembered there were no trees close enough to reach the house, a chill ran through me. Slowly, I stood and crept toward the door, the soft carpet muffling my footsteps. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of the glass beyond them reflected the light from inside. Another tap, this time sharper. My heart quickened and I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to look, but curiosity won. I reached out and pulled the curtain aside. Just an inch, just enough to peek. At first, all I saw was my own reflection staring back at me, eyes wide with fear. But then movement caught my eye. There, on the other side of the glass, was a pale hand with long, slender fingers. It hovered just above the surface, the nails lightly tapping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I couldn't see the figure's face, just the hand and the vague suggestion of a shadowy form beyond the glass. The hand paused, then splayed its fingers wide before pressing its palm flat against the window. My breath caught in my throat as a cold wave of dread washed over me. For what felt like hours, we stayed like that, me staring out, the figure standing just beyond the glass. And then, ever so slowly, the hand began to slide upward, leaving a faint, foggy streak on the pane. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I stepped backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't listen. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand vanished. The air outside seemed to shift, and the glass was empty again, just my trembling reflection staring back at me. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge, and I kept the curtains drawn tight, afraid of what I might see if I looked again. The next morning, in the pale light of dawn, I forced myself to check the door. The glass was clean, no streaks, no handprints, nothing to prove what I had seen. And yet, deep down, I knew it hadn't been a dream. To this day, I can't stand sitting near uncovered windows at night, because sometimes, late in the quiet hours, I still hear it, that soft, deliberate tapping on the glass. The man in the closet when I was 12. My family moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of a quiet Midwestern town. The house was old, with crooked floors and doors that didn't quite fit their frames. But my parents were thrilled to have found something affordable. My bedroom was at the end of a narrow hallway, and though it was small, I didn't mind. What did bother me, though, was the closet. It wasn't especially large, just a shallow space with a flimsy wooden door and a single shelf. But there was something about it that felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, not even to myself. During the day, it looked perfectly ordinary, yet every night as I lay in bed, I felt an intense awareness of it. It was like the air changed around it, thickening with a presence I couldn't see. The first time I heard it, I thought I was dreaming. A faint shuffling sound, like feet dragging softly across the floorboards inside the closet. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, and then stopped. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at the closet door, but it didn't move. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted back to sleep, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But the next night, it happened again, and this time, I was fully awake. The shuffling was louder now, and I swore I heard a soft exhale, like someone breathing just inches from the door. I pulled the covers over my head and lay frozen, every muscle in my body tense. As the weeks went on, the noises became more frequent. Sometimes it sounded like faint scratching, as if long nails were dragging across the inside of the door. Other times, I heard the soft creak of the shelf, as though something heavy was shifting its weight. I finally worked up the courage to tell my parents. They brushed it off with the usual reassurances. Old houses make noises and there's nothing in there but your clothes. But I knew better. Something was in that closet. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to face my fear. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, took a deep breath and swung the closet door open. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but hanging shirts and boxes stacked on the floor. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. But as I lowered the flashlight, I noticed something strange. The air inside the closet was ice cold, far colder than the rest of the room. I shut the door quickly and climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. As I drifted off, I swore I heard a whisper, so faint I couldn't make out the words, coming from behind the closet door. We moved out a few months later when my dad's job took us to another state. The first night in our new house, I slept soundly for the first time in what felt like forever. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of that old closet. In the dream, the door is always slightly ajar, and in the darkness beyond, two pale eyes stare back at me. The thing in the woods. When I was 17, my friends and I thought we were invincible. We'd spend long summer nights out in the woods behind my neighborhood, building fires, telling scary stories, and daring each other to do stupid things. The woods seemed harmless enough during the day, just a tangle of trees and brush stretching out for miles. But at night, they took on a different character. The air felt heavier, the silence pressed in, and shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned amber, we decided to stay later than usual. Someone had heard about an old, crumbling cabin deep in the woods, a place kids whispered about at school, but no one could ever seem to find. So, of course, we had to go looking for it. Flashlights in hand, we set out, laughing to keep our nerves at bay. For the first hour, everything felt normal. We followed deer trails and pushed through overgrown paths, the sound of crickets and frogs our constant companions. But the deeper we went, the quieter it became. The night sounds faded until there was nothing, no wind, no insects, not even the distant hoot of an owl. That's when we heard it, a soft rustling just off the path. We froze, our flashlights darting toward the sound. A raccoon, maybe? Or a deer? But then the sound came again, closer this time, and it was followed by something else, a low, guttural growl. We didn't wait to see what it was. Laughing nervously, we turned back the way we came, trying to keep up the bravado even as our pace quickened. But the woods didn't look the same anymore. The trails were unfamiliar, the trees too densely packed, their branches clawing at us like grasping hands. Behind us, the rustling grew louder, followed by the unmistakable snap of a branch. Whatever it was following us. We broke into a run, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we crashed through the underbrush. Somewhere along the way, I tripped and went sprawling in the dirt, my flashlight skidding out of reach. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw it just for a second. It stood between the trees, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth, if it even had one, seemed stretched into a grin that was all wrong. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, my legs moving on pure instinct. My friend's shout snapped me out of it, and I bolted, not daring to look behind me again. When we finally burst out of the woods and into the open field near my house, we didn't stop running until we reached my driveway. We stood there, gasping for air, too terrified to speak. We never went back to those woods again, and though we stopped talking about that night, I know we all saw the same thing, even now, years later. I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, certain that I hear branches snapping outside my window. The figure in the rear-view mirror I'd been driving for hours on an empty stretch of highway, the kind where the road seems to go on forever with nothing but fields and forest on either side. It was past midnight, and the only light came from my high beams cutting through the darkness and the faint glow of the dashboard. The radio had long lost its signal, leaving me alone with the low hum of the engine and my own thoughts. The monotony of the road was hypnotic, and I kept fighting to keep my eyelids from growing heavy. Somewhere between one small town and the next, I noticed movement in my rear-view mirror. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the kind of flicker you see when you're tired and the shadows play tricks on you. But when I glanced again, I saw it clearly. Someone was sitting in the back seat. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The figure was faint, almost transparent in the dim light, but I could make out the shape of a man. He sat perfectly still, his head slightly bowed as if staring at the floor. Panic surged through me. I hadn't stopped anywhere. There was no way anyone could have gotten into my car. I wanted to pull over, to fling open the door and run. But the highway was surrounded by nothing but endless darkness. The thought of stepping out into that void felt worse than staying in the car. I forced myself to keep driving, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then his head slowly lifted. In the mirror, I saw a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes staring back at me. His lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I felt a wave of icy air sweep through the car, and the faint smell of earth, wet and heavy, filled my nose. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes on the road, but I couldn't stop glancing at the mirror. He was still there, never blinking, never breaking his gaze. As the highway stretched on, my headlights illuminated a sign for a gas station up ahead. Relief surged through me. I swerved off the road and pulled into the empty lot, slamming the gear shift into park. My hands shook as I turned around to confront him, but the back seat was empty. I sat there for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. The air felt warmer now, the smell of earth gone. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I got out of the car, checked every door, every window, locked. The lot was silent except for the faint buzz of a flickering light above the station. When I finally dared to look into the back seat again, there was nothing but shadows. I don't know if he ever truly left. Even now, years later, I still avoid looking in the rear-view mirror when I'm driving at night, because sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I swear I see those hollow eyes staring back at me. The boy at the edge of the lake. There's a small lake near where I grew up, tucked away in a forest that was quiet even in the middle of summer. As kids, my friends and I would ride our bikes there, spending entire afternoons skipping stones across the glassy surface and daring each other to swim out to the center. But one summer, when I was 12, something happened that made me swear I'd never go back. It was late July, the air heavy with the smell of pine and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. I'd gone to the lake alone that day, hoping to enjoy the peace of the water without my friends splashing and shouting around me. I settled on a rock near the edge, my feet dangling just above the surface, and watched as dragonflies darted across the shallows. That's when I noticed him. A boy stood across the lake, maybe 50 yards away, half hidden among the reeds. He looked about my age, barefoot and wearing clothes that seemed too big for him, a white shirt hanging loose over bony shoulders. At first, I thought he might be someone from a neighboring town, a kid like me looking for a quiet place to escape the heat. But something felt off. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just stood there, staring at me. Even at that distance, I could feel the weight of his gaze. I tried to shrug it off, but an uneasy chill spread through me, despite the summer sun beating down on my back. After a few minutes, I decided to leave. I gathered my backpack and turned toward the trail, but curiosity got the better of me. I glanced back one more time and froze. The boy was gone. The reeds swayed gently where he had been standing, as if someone had just passed through. A ripple spread across the surface of the lake, moving toward me. My breath caught. I stepped back instinctively, my heel catching on a root. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale face in the water, just beneath the surface, to wide, dark eyes staring up at me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I ran all the way home, heart pounding, my legs aching from the effort. That night, I told my mother what I'd seen. She grew quiet, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. "You shouldn't go to that lake alone," she said finally. When I asked why, she wouldn't answer. Years later, I overheard my uncle talking about the lake. He said a boy had drowned there decades ago. Pulled under by the reeds, they thought, though no one saw it happen. His body wasn't recovered for weeks, and when it was, his eyes were still open. I've never gone back to that lake, but sometimes when I dream, I find myself standing on that same rock, staring across the water, and on the far shore, he's always there, barefoot, silent, watching. The thing at the end of the hall. When I was 8 years old, my family moved into a narrow 2-story house with long hallways that seemed to stretch farther than they should. My bedroom was upstairs at the very end of the hall, past the bathroom and my parents' room. During the day, the house felt ordinary. Sunlight poured in through tall windows, and the wooden floors creaked pleasantly as I played with my toys. But at night, when the lights were off and the hallway stretched into shadow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something waited for me at the far end. The first time I noticed it, I was getting up for water. The hall was dimly lit by a small nightlight plugged in near the stairs. As I stepped out of my room, I froze. At the far end of the hall, near the closet door, I thought I saw movement, a faint shape, darker than the shadows around it. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me. I rubbed my eyes and shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. But when I looked again, it was still there, low to the ground, hunched over, its shape shifting slightly like smoke in a breeze. Fear rooted me in place. I couldn't breathe. Then, in an instant, it darted into the closet with a speed that didn't seem possible. I bolted back to my bed, pulled the covers over my head and didn't move until morning. When I told my mom, she smiled gently and said, "It was just a dream." But it didn't feel like a dream. Over the next few weeks, I began avoiding the hallway at night. If I needed water or the bathroom, I'd run as fast as I could, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. But no matter how quick I was, I always felt it. This weight pressing down on me, this sense of being watched from the end of the hall. One night, I woke to the sound of soft scratching outside my door. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I held my breath, praying it would stop. After a few moments, the scratching gave way to a faint whisper, words I couldn't understand, spoken in a voice too low and raspy to be human. The next morning, I checked the hallway. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I looked closely, I noticed faint marks on my door, small, curved scratches as if made by fingers.